Homeostasis in the body. So what are some of the objectives for this video? The first is to be able to define thermoregulation. The second is to be able to relate thermoregulation to homeostasis. And lastly, be able to understand and explain thermoregulation in regards to the black box theory. So what is thermoregulation? Thermoregulation is maintaining internal body temperature regardless of external changes. Meaning that if you go outside on a very, very hot day or a very, very cold day, regardless of the temperature, your internal temperature stays the same. So at the beginning of the series, my colleague explained the black box theory. Now we're going to look at the black box theory in relation to the human body, specifically thermoregulation. So in regards to the black box theory, the human body would be considered the black box, meaning that despite all of the changes, all of the external changes, whether it's temperature or it's the availability of oxygen or what have you, the body maintains its internal environment. And how does it do this? It does this by inducing quite a few mechanisms to maintain its internal environment. And this is very important to maintain the functionality of the body. Now let's look at an example. So let's say it's a very, very hot day. So the normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. Now let's say it's 43 degrees Celsius outside. So what happens? The external temperature is changing, but the body has to maintain that internal state, that steady state, in order to continue functioning efficiently. So there's this preoptic area of the hypothalamus, which functions essentially as a thermostat. So what happens is that preoptic area receives signals from the peripheral thermoreceptors on the skin. Once it receives these signals are sent to another area in the hypothalamus known as the anterior nucleus, and this is known as the heat loss center. So once the message is received in the heat loss sensor, it stimulates vasodilation. Vasodilation increases blood flow to the body surface and promotes heat loss, essentially bringing the body back to that internal temperature. But what happens if this mechanism is just not enough to bring the body back to that internal temperature, to that steady state? So the body has another mechanism. So essentially it starts with the same. The normal body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. It's 43 degrees outside, 43 degrees Celsius outside. So the hypothalamus recognizes this. It stimulates the anterior nuclei or the heat loss center and promotes vasodilation. But in addition, it also produces sweating. Now, sweating is another way for the body to remove heat to bring it back to that internal temperature. And this is a picture of our little guy over here sweating and trying to, once again, maintain that internal temperature, trying to lose some heat. Now let's look at another example. Let's say it's really cold outside. So as we know now, internal temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. Now if it's 0 degrees Celsius outside, it's extremely, extremely cold. The body has to produce mechanisms in order to, once again, maintain that internal temperature, that 37 degrees Celsius. So once again, we have our preoptic area of the hypothalamus, which we know now functions as a thermostat. It receives the signals from the peripheral thermoreceptor saying, oh, it's really, really cold outside. Let's warm up. So it sends a signal, but instead of the anterior nucleus, it now sends it to the posterior nucleus. This stimulates vasoconstriction, and vasoconstriction works by it keeps blood deeper in the body, so there's less heat loss. And then now our body can return back to its internal temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. Now, just like the last example in warm climate, what if this mechanism just is not enough? It just does not suffice to return the body back to its internal state. There's a similar mechanism that we saw in the warm climate. So we have our 37 degrees Celsius internal temperature. It's 0 degrees outside. We have the hypothalamus that's stimulated, which in turn stimulates the posterior nucleus or the heat promoting sensor. Now, if vasoconstriction isn't enough, what happens is our body induces shivering. And that shivering movement is essentially producing energy. It's increasing our internal temperature, essentially bringing it back to that steady state, that normal state of 37 degrees Celsius. And here's an example of our little guy shivering in order to return to that 37 degrees Celsius ideal body temperature. So what is the take-home message? Essentially, the take-home message is there will always be a fluctuation in the environment. As we saw, temperature isn't steady. You have some days it's really, really cold, some days it's really, really hot, some days it's intermediate. So your body has to be able to endure that change and maintain its internal environment in order to continue its function. Thermoregulation is a prime example of this. Like we saw before, we had the hypothalamus stimulating vasoconstriction and vasodilation in order to keep that body in that steady state, in order to keep that body in that internal state so that it functions essentially. And here is my references, and thank you guys for watching.